Welcome to one of our Digital Trust and Society seminar series. This is run by our Digital Futures Programme. I keep counting. I think that slide's out of date. I think we've got about 1,800 researchers on the programme now. It's absolutely fantastic across the university. It's often difficult to, when you're particularly looking at sort of the mix of theory and practice, to be able to stay focused on particular issues. But what we do at the university is to look at particular challenges like employment and productivity, Industry 5, cities and the environment, citizens and democracy. I've got a great big long list here. Creative tech, the actual practical applications of digital technologies. But we've also recognised that there are some areas, of which of course digital trust and security, which are kind of cross-cutting, that all of those areas need to know about and need to have embedded in them. And we've done this, or made sure of this, by organising a Centre for Digital Trust and Society. This is Manchester. In Manchester, we like to do things differently. So two things. Firstly, if you think about security in the UK, people often think about Cheltenham and GCHQ. GCHQ houses itself there since I don't know when. You'll probably know more about the history if you look at Bletchley Park and when it moved to Cheltenham, and it's grown, and they are very, very proud of the ecosystem that they have there. However, it's very limited in terms of diversity, and in fact, just generally in terms of numbers. So when they looked to find out where should be the first place that they open up a major headquarters outside that area, they realised that, to use their words, to protect the nation, they must reflect the nation. And whereas GCHQ attracted an ecosystem, our ecosystem in Greater Manchester attracted GCHQ. So we're really, really proud of that, of the social structure, and particularly of the community structure. Now, a few months back, can't quite remember when it was, all I can say is, I mean, we host lots of events here, but CyBlack exploded in this area, and it was absolutely fantastic in terms of the camaraderie and the energy, and also the variation on food. I don't know what it is about most cybersecurity things. They think that everybody will be happy if they just give them beer and pizza, you know, which obviously is particularly limiting to people who don't like pizza and don't drink. But the community atmosphere was great, and then met a couple of new colleagues, and they were sort of saying things. Well, they've looked at my LinkedIn page or whatever, and then I looked at theirs and I thought, why do they want to talk to me? I want to talk to them. And then kind of the strange request, very modestly asked whether they could come and make a contribution to our seminar series. And it was, as the saying goes, an absolute no-brainer. And I've been waiting about this for months. My only complaint is this was months ago that we set this up, and I've been waiting months and months and months for this. And so curses on the train strike for keeping people from it. Although I think that machine probably tends to suggest that it is being recorded for posterity. Because I've looked at the work that you're doing, and I think this is hopefully, as the saying goes, at the end of Casablanca, famous film. I know you won't have watched it because it's a monochrome film. No. Yeah, I know. Listen, these days I hear Star Wars to the students, and most of them haven't heard of it. Really showing our age. But a couple of relatively new colleagues breaking out onto the scene, who are already have got the idea from the technical and governance and the social rules of cybersecurity all the way through to the community field. So I'm going to step back, and I know I'm going to learn from this session. Welcome everybody, and welcome to our speakers too.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to Prof. Danny for that beautiful introduction. My name is Dr. Iretioluwa Akerele, and today I'll be talking about my research, which is to build an information systems security controls, integration and implementation roadmap for optimal security maturity. I schooled in University College Cork, which is a university in Republic of Ireland. This is a brief about me. I have a decade experience in information security. This is consisting of academia, industry, and consulting experience. I'm a cybersecurity career coach and mentor. I have experience in grooming people to get into the cybersecurity field, supporting people to get cybersecurity jobs in the UK and across Africa. I'm a director of a company called CyBlack Limited, CyBlack is registered currently in the UK and in Nigeria. I'm a co-founder of an organization called CyBlack. CyBlack is a charity organization that is helping people, blacks within UK, to achieve what they want to achieve in terms of cybersecurity. And lastly, I'm an advisory board member of CyberSafe Foundation. CyberSafe is an organization that is helping young women to get their talent in cybersecurity. So I'm going to go straight into the content of my research today. I'm going to start by talking about the motivation for my research. Why did I go into this research? I'll go on to talk about my research objective and questions. I'll talk about the process flow for my research. I'll talk about my contribution by chapter. I'll look at my recommendations and talk about my future research. Starting with the motivation, why did I decide to look into this topic about building an information systems control that will help organizations? I started because of this. There has been an increase in cybersecurity threats over the years. Previously, what we used to see about cybersecurity attacks and threats was not what we used to see as at now, today. For example, there's a study that shows that over 15.1 billion records were exposed in 2019. That is a lot when you look at it in terms of records. How would you feel, anybody in this room, if you find that your personal record is out there without your consent? I'm sure nobody in this room is going to like that. So that means that cybersecurity threats has increased. Attacks have increased over the years. And because of that, we need to look at ways by which we can work towards reducing that by way of research and also industry collaboration. Another reason why I looked into this research is because of challenges with identifying and selecting effective IS security controls in organizations. As someone who has lots of experience within the industry, one of the things that I found is that organizations struggle in terms of what are the kind of controls that we need to implement. Are we implementing the right controls in terms of technical, operational, or management controls? So one of the things I try to look at is how do I assist organizations to be able to effectively identify their controls and ensure that they are selecting effective controls. And the last reason for my motivation for my research is because when I did my literature, I found that there has been lack of research to properly assess the maturity level of IS security controls in organizations. What do I mean by that? When organizations identify and select their controls, they don't put more effort in terms of assessing the maturity. Is this control at an optimized level or not? Are we just starting out with this control? What else do we need to do to ensure that we are using the right controls within the organization? And because of that, I came up with my research objective and questions. Now, what is my research objective? Building an information system security controls integration and implementation roadmap for optimal security maturity. I'm going to go ahead to explain this in more details in the subsequent slides. What are my questions? What did I want to answer to achieve this objective that is here? First question was from the literature review. What are the types of IS security controls that organizations are using and prioritizing to protect their information assets? What are the controls that they are using? Are they using controls like awareness, identity and access management, for example, cryptography, and other types of controls? I moved on, and my second research question was more practice-focused. How are IS security controls used in organizations? After understanding the types of controls, the next thing is to know how organizations are using these controls within their environments. And my third research question is to understand how organizations are integrating and implementing their controls to design the optimal security solution. So I'm going to go ahead to explain my research process flow, which is very critical to this research. I started from literature review, and what did I do? I analyzed 837 research papers within the period of 1 month. What was I looking for when I was analyzing those papers? I was looking for what is called the IS security themes. I was trying to understand what is key or what is particular to these papers I was looking for. Example is in this slide, and I'm going to be going back and forth. These are the themes that came out from the 837 research papers that I looked at. I saw themes around operation security, data security, mobile device, and so on and so forth. So what did I do? I grouped them to 3 types of controls based on research again: technical controls, operational controls, and management controls. So when I did that, I was able to develop an IS security landscape. after identifying these themes, and I'm going to get to that as part of this presentation today. Moving on from literature review, I moved on to what is called a survey. And what did I do? I wanted to see how to validate what I've gotten from literature to what is happening in practice. So I went to industry and I took a set of questions to them, 55 practitioners, to say that, here is what I found from the literature. Can you please help me validate this, just by way of yes or no? Are you using this control in your organization or not? So going back to this, an example is information security compliance. Is there a way that you've been able to ascertain if your organization is compliant with information security controls or not? And then the response I expect from them is just yes or no. And this is to help with my research. So what did I do? Achieving that, I was able to validate the controls from literature to practice, to say, here is what is happening within literature, and this is what is happening in practice. Outcome of that is an IS security framework that I was able to develop. Moving on, after the survey part, I moved to interviews. I was able to identify 32 IS security practitioners. And what I did at this point is to understand, after the yes or no, how are they using these controls within the organization? So for example, if you say that, yes, in terms of information security compliance, what ways have you been able to ensure compliance in your organization? Then they give that breakdown in details, and this is also to help with my research. So what did I achieve with that? I was able to understand the usage. How are they using the controls? The integration of the controls and the way they implement those controls. And that led to the outcome of me developing IS security controls usage model and an IS security roadmap, which is very key to my research. Moving on from interviews, I conducted a focus group session with 8 practitioners. What did I want to achieve with the focus group? I wanted to understand the maturity levels of these controls. If you say you are using this control in your organization, is it at an optimized level, for example, or is the control still non-existent, or is it at an ad hoc level that you are using it? So being able to understand that will also help in terms of my recommendations from this research. And at the end of the day, I was also able to determine the average maturity of the controls. Moving on from that, I went through a document analysis. And what did I do with it? It's applicable in organizations, for example. How many controls from the controls that I got from my research is applicable within this best practice? So I did a comparison of that, and that helped me to have an IS security mapping, which is very critical to my research. So I'm going to go through my research contribution by chapter. Starting, before I go through the contribution by chapter, I'll first say from literature and then to practice. From literature, what did I do? I was able to define information security. Now, why did I define information security? There's a quote from literature that says that you need to understand the problem before you can even solve it. What I found from research is that when previous researchers were defining information security, they were looking at the process and technology perspective, and they left one key important part, which is people. So I felt that for me to say that I need to address this problem, then I need to include people in the definition of information security. So I did that first, and after doing that, I developed an IS security landscape based on the analysis I did from the literature that consisted of 837 research papers. I was able to look at the theories that were used, the methodologies that were used in these papers, the themes that were coming up in these papers, and I was able to also say that these are gaps because some of these controls are frequent in these papers than others. So I was able to use that to develop an IS security landscape. Now, my third contribution to literature was that I was also able to call out the IS community, IS in this instance is information systems, to say that, look, there are some failures here. Here are some of the gaps that you need to look at to ensure that we have a community where information security is also at the forefront because it is becoming critical. Now, moving to practice, these are some of the sectors that I considered: financial, education, government, and so on and so forth. What did I do from practice? First was validation of what I got from the literature, which helped to develop an IS security framework. And then moving on from that, development of an IS security model. And lastly, development of the roadmap that I talked about. Now, this is the definition of information security that I came up with after looking at several papers and saying that the focus for information security has been largely from process and technology perspective. So I felt that it is important to include people, which is one of the key things when it comes to information security. And that is why that definition is there. People, process, and technology is key points for information security, not just process and technology alone. Moving on from that, this is what my IS security research landscape looks like. Like I said, I looked at methodologies, I looked at different theories, I looked at organizational size, and I looked at the gaps that is coming out from the research analysis that I did. What are the controls that researchers are not looking at? Example, information security assets. Researchers are not really looking into this as part of research, and it's important because in industry, we are saying that information security is the protection of information assets. So if we are not getting enough papers coming out from that, how do we ensure that we align industry with practice? So that is one key thing for me, for my study. What are the areas that are coming out more? Education, training, and awareness. There has been lots of research in terms of security, education, training, and awareness over the years, which is good, and I also raised it as part of my research. Another one is human aspect of information security. There has been a lot of research in terms of behavior, psychology, analysis, how humans contribute to information security, which is also good and was listed as a priority. Moving on, this is one key thing I developed as part of my research, which is the IS security research framework. Like I said, I divided the controls to 3 types, and this is also based on research: technical controls, operational controls, and management controls. Now, what did I do? Based on what I did from literature, I was able to say that some controls are highly researched, some are moderately researched, and some are not well researched. Moving to practice, some of these controls are highly applied or not well applied, based on the yes or no that I got from the participants. So if they say that they are using this control in the organization, for example, it comes as a yes. If they say otherwise, it is a no. So based on that, I'm able to say that there are controls that are highly researched in literature and probably not highly applied in practice, and the other way around. But what I'm trying to do with my research is that I want a synergy whereby if it is highly researched in literature, it should also be highly applied in practice, because we are saying that cybersecurity threats are now increasing, and we must be able to align industry with academia, which is very important and key. Moving on, this is my contribution in chapter 3. Like I said, I spoke to 55 participants initially for the yes or no part of the questionnaire, and then I moved on to 32 participants for my interviews, and after which I moved on to 8 participants for the focus group session. Going to my chapter 4, this is one of my big contributions, which is an IS security model. What did I do with this? I was able to call out openly that this is what is happening in terms of technical controls. For example, I said that only 29% of technical controls are highly researched, even though 83% are applied to prevent misuse and ensure compliance. What does that mean? From the academic standpoint, researchers have not done a lot to research these technical controls, right? But in the industry standpoint, they are applying these controls. But what my research is saying is that there has to be a synergy between research and practice for us to get to where we need to get to. Same thing with operational controls. 76% of operational controls are highly researched, even though 85% are applied. Again, my research is saying that a synergy is important, such that when research is coming in these areas, practice should also come up with controls in place to ensure that they are protecting their infrastructure and reducing the potential threats of cyber attacks. Management controls, 100% of management controls are highly researched, yet there's a significant increase in cyber attacks. Even though from the management control standpoint, researchers have done a lot from this part, but we're still seeing that there's a significant increase in cyber attacks. So it means that even from the industry perspective, there needs to be more work that should be done. So my recommendation is that the gaps from research and practice should be addressed, because if those gaps are not addressed, it's going to lead to weaknesses in the field, which will definitely lead to cyber attacks, as it is. Moving on, this is from my interview, and I was able to highlight from what practitioners are saying. what are the high priority controls and what are the low priority controls? Example, during my interview, I found that in technical controls, practitioners are saying that, yes, we have ways by which we manage our identity and access management in the organization, either by the use of tools or by creating processes in place to ensure that they do the right thing. But you find that controls around data security, which is very critical, and network security, some of these organizations have not paid adequate attention to it. But what my research is saying that you have to prioritize all controls, because if you want to reduce the rates of cyber threats that will lead to attacks, if one control is low priority in your organization, that may be the weak point for that cyber threat or attack. So it is important to put all controls in terms of priority. Going to operational controls, managing security assets is one control that is listed as high priority. But some organizations have said that we can't afford to do security awareness and training. Example, one of them said that when COVID hit the organization, they started to prioritize. And they said that in terms of budgets, their budgets reduced, and they felt that the first thing not to do is security awareness and training. And for me, as an information security practitioner, I would say that if you don't train your employees thinking that because you need to reduce your budget, when the attack happens and you need to pay $1 million, for example, you will lose a whole lot more that would have cost you to train those employees. So what I'm saying in essence is that there needs to be a point where organizations would say that even though there are factors that would be in place, we still need to ensure we do this for the safety of our organization in the long run. Moving to management controls, both controls identified as management controls were seen as low priority controls because the organizations have issues around governance, risk, and then of course compliance. Why is it important to have all controls as high priority? Because you need to reduce cyber attacks in organizations. You need to ensure full integration of controls. What that means is that technical control, operational, and management must be integrated to achieve what the organization needs to achieve. Alignment to best practice is key. And lastly, to achieve security goals. What are some of the limitations I found why organizations are not having high priority controls? Some of them mentioned cost as a factor. Some is because of their sector. They feel that cybersecurity is not the first thing for them to think about when it comes to their sector. Some because of organizational size. What a large organization will worry about is different from what a small organization will worry about. And in some cases, there are context. And lastly, environmental factors like the COVID pandemic. This is what I did in terms of mapping, document mapping best practice to control types. So the highlight shows that in this best practice like ISO 27001, for example, all these controls are required in the ISO 27001 standard. For some other best practice like the GDPR, it's not every of those controls that are covered there. So this is just to show the gaps that exist in terms of these controls. Some of them are not covered in this best practice or not. What are the gaps from the organization? Example, like I gave, an organization said that they've not done security awareness and training due to dwindling revenue because of the coronavirus. Coronavirus came, but it should not be a reason why an organization should not consider something as important as security awareness and training, which is very key. These are the sectors, again, that I looked at to be able to come up with what was said in the study. This roadmap is one of my key outputs of this study and is a 6-step roadmap, starting from step 1, which is technical controls for protection, which says that organizations must be able to select, which is key, select technical controls and use them. So the point where you select your controls, as you keep going with the process, you need to assess the maturity. How mature is this particular control? Can I say that we have reached a level 5 with this control or not? And the last point for technical control is to use technologies to protect against cyber threats. Organizations need to start thinking about the use of technologies to ensure that they're able to protect themselves against cyber threats. Moving on, operational controls is the second part of the roadmap. And the first thing is ensuring the adoption of operational controls, which is key. How are organizations adopting operational controls within their environment? Assessing the maturity of this control is another very key part of it. Moving on to management controls for monitoring. Organizations need to develop organizational structure for strategic decision making. One of the gaps I found during the study is that at the top, which is the key for cybersecurity in organizations, key roles like the CISO are missing in some organizations. If that representative is not there from the top management, they may miss it because of strategic decisions that needs to be taken. Ensuring compliance with regulation standards and frameworks is becoming very important in every organization. They need to decide which of these standards do we need to comply to, based on laws, based on regulations, or based on business requirements. And the last part there is to ensure that the assessment of the maturity of the controls is done. Moving on in the roadmap, the next part is to assign priority to these controls. How do you prioritize? Just like I said in the previous slide, which controls should be high priority? If you ask me, for example, I would say every control should be high priority, because the control that you would leave as low priority may be the weak points for a cyber attacker. And I'll give an example. In real practice, part of the job that I've done, I've seen cases where you see people who write their password down and they leave it by their desk. And then someone else comes, picks the password and uses it as a way to gain entry to their system. That's a weak point that the person has not taken cognizance of. The adoption of these controls must be prioritized. And moving to the next step of the roadmap, how are these controls used? Ensure the usage of these controls across all sectors. Do not say that because I work in government, for example, we don't need to apply a particular control because we are government, we are covered. Or you don't say that because my business is small, it's a small business, so why should I train my staff? Why should I bother? Because it's a small business, nothing can happen. Or do not say that because you are working in partnership with a friend that you trust. So you feel that if you share your password, for example, you are safe because you trust the person. Cybersecurity has a zero trust principle, which is very key, right? And then the last part of the roadmap is integration and implementation. The entire controls needs to be integrated for it to be successfully implemented. So it is important that don't say in my organization, we want to only use technical. We don't have any business with operational or management. It doesn't work that way. You need to integrate the entire controls and ensure that as you are implementing technical, you're also implementing operational and management controls. So my chapter 6, I was able to answer my research questions just as I've explained, the landscape framework, control usage model, and the roadmap. What are the recommendations for my research? First, like I talked about, is synergy. Synergy between research and practice is key. As someone who has experience from research and also practice, that synergy is what is going to help. So researchers cannot work in isolation. They need to work with the industry. Understand the gaps from the industry, and how can you conduct research to be able to identify those gaps and bring it to the forefront. This is very key. Welcoming publications is very important. Applying the controls is key. If the controls are well researched in literature, you also need to apply it to practice. And the last part of my contribution, of my recommendation, is to contribute to more domain areas. So for example, if you are interested in research, you can do it. You can think about what you want to do in terms of information security and think about how to contribute by way of research, because the research that we have today is not enough. Things are changing, times are changing, everything is evolving. You hear some cyber attacks and you'll be shocked, because if you hear about it today, probably 10 years ago, it's not what you would have thought about. I learned about a cyber attack where someone was sent a fake interview invite and he went for the interview, everything looked real. The first stage he passed, second stage he passed, and was given the offer. He used his organization system to download the offer letter, and that was how the organization was breached. So what I'm saying is that 10 years ago, probably nobody would have thought that something like this would happen. But we are here now, and these are the kind of attacks that we face. So it means that things are changing. So you can think about, how do I contribute to domain areas in research so that I can bridge the gap in practice? Okay? The other part of my recommendation is adoption of the roadmap. The roadmap I have built can be adopted in any sector, in any organization. If you are not working at the moment, you can also adopt it as a project. Just think about the controls and how you can apply those controls. You can take it as a project and use it. It is very, very good. No, irrespective of the sector, even if it's education, financial sector, government sector, or any sector at all, the roadmap can be applied. What is my future research talking about? Expand the scope of the highest journals. For the purpose of my research, I looked at 22 research journals within information systems. It is possible that there is room for growth, there is room for expansion. So other research papers can be considered, for example, to have a more robust outlook to this kind of research. Building cases for comparison will be an interesting future research to do. For example, you can look at how it is done in financial organizations, how it is done in government, and compare. What is it like in financial organizations if you apply all those controls? What is it like in government if you apply all those controls? So those cases would help to see if the organization is on the right trajectory or not, right? Testing the high security roadmap in specific sectors is very good. Just like I've said, build the cases and then you test it. And the last one there is test the maturity of all the controls. I tested just few controls, but for a future research, for example, you can think about testing all the controls. What is the maturity? Taking it live to the organization and telling them that based on the tests I've carried out, there are room for improvement in this area or not, which is very key. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. I'm happy to take questions now.
Yeah.
So, you find about optimal security maturity or maturity of operational controls that you were talking about throughout the presentation. So, can this be used in a way to define the measurement of a security implemented in the company?
Yes.
So, we have a certain number of, security controls, the more mature they are, they are more effectively implemented. So, can this be used as a level of measurement for security in the company?
Yes, very good question, and I will just take that quickly. Yes, you can. And how it works is that you take those controls, for example, like example of the ones I've listed, when you list them out, and you test the maturity, and I'll just give like a practical way to test a control's maturity. For example, security awareness and training, if you take that control to an organization, you can start by finding out what is the frequency, how often do they conduct security awareness and training for their employees, for example. If they give you that frequency, you can find out the type or the method they use. What are the ways by which they conduct security awareness and training? They will give you all of those responses. You will be able to determine the maturity. Are they in a matured state or not? For example, if they say that within one calendar year, they only conduct security awareness once, you will be able to determine as a practitioner that they are not at a matured state. Because what happens is that if they conduct an awareness once, and maybe you leave the organization, and another person comes in, that person is not trained, the person is not aware of security practices, there is a possibility that that person would be the weak link in that organization. So security awareness and training is a continuous process, and you will be able to tell them that, look, because of this, I can tell you that the maturity of this control is still at a low level, but these are the things that you can do to ensure that you take it to this maturity. And then that's where you come in to say that, for example, you can increase the frequency, you can bring in different methods to make it interesting to your audience, you can use maybe screensavers, banners, trainings like this, and so on and so forth. And when they do that over the years, you can go back there, test the maturity again, and then you'll be able to say that, okay, it was this previously, but based on the recommendations they've taken from this is the point they are now.
Just one more follow-up question.
Yes.
So you also mentioned about you cannot assign priorities to a security control, because if one security control is not implemented, it will become the weak point of a particular organization. But I believe that putting them into tiers talks about how important what basic terms are required for a company to remain compliant in security. So maybe having a training for employees are more important than having a two-factor authentication system, for example, because people are usually regarded the weakest link in the cybersecurity.
Yeah. Let me just, I think what I said was that you assign priority, but what I said was that the comfort for me, and this is me talking as a practitioner, the comfort for me is if all the controls are high priority. So if you tell me, for example, that you have a password, but you are not implementing something as a two-factor authentication, you've put that as a low priority. That two-factor authentication that is a low priority is the weak point for the organization. Are you getting me? So the point is, do not say some should be high priority, some should be low priority. What attackers do is that they look for weak points, and those controls that are low priority are definitely the weak points to the organization.
Thank you.
Question?
Yeah, there and there.
Very interesting. I'd love to see the mapping of existing controls. So you mentioned ISO 27001,
Yes.
which is for probably large organisations, not for small organisations. So how many of those controls, organisations that you assessed, had existing international controls, ISO 27001, across the size of the organisation, across the sector? Because I think having ISO 27001 is great for large organisations, but
Yeah.
probably not for a small business.
Yeah.
So how do you see that playing with the size of the organisation with all the controls?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and yes, you are very correct. So what I saw from my research was that a standard like the ISO 27001, just like you've said, when I take that question in terms of compliance regulations to large organizations, I would say 80 to 90% of those large organizations are most likely compliant to the ISO 27001. But when I take the same question to a small organization, there will be factors. One can be cost, two can be because there is no compliance regulation or industry regulation saying that you have to comply to this standard. So they just put it at the back and focus on other things. So it's actually a gap that I also saw where some organizations had come to say that, look, we are not compliant to any best practice requirements. What we just do is we ensure that we apply some controls within the organization. But in terms of best practice, important best practices like the ISO 27001, they are not compliant to it.
And do you see differences between different countries?
Yes. So what I didn't mention is that the countries cut across in my research is Europe, Africa, and of course America. And Asia, rather. America and Asia. Yeah. So different across different countries.
Do you see differences between the...
I also say, so differences in terms of regulations, for
Yeah.
example, within EU, you see things like GDPR. In America, you see something else. In Africa, you see the NDPR. ISO 27001 across all countries,
Yeah.
because it's, of course, internationally applicable.
My question is, in your research, did you include how organizations can deal with smart hackers or zero-day attacks?
Can deal with the attack.
Smart hackers or zero-day attacks?
0 day.
How would you connect those controls to those
Okay.
particular forms of threat?
So what I did in my research, not particular, I didn't single out threats, but there's a control, which is operational security, that covers things around vulnerabilities and threats. And specific, when questions are asked, some of them give those kind of examples, specific threats. And I also look at that to say that, okay, is this control applicable in this organization based on whatever response they've given or not?
I'm kind of going back onto the question about small and large companies, actually. In a smaller company which has a much reduced budget, probably even reduced IT staff as well to actually put some of these controls in place, would you have, through the research you've done, would you say there are some controls that were very common to those smaller, so for example, they would say passwords because that's an easy, free or very low cost thing to put in place and gives them maximum bang for buck at that level of control. Where if someone to put triple des encryption on every single cloud database, they can't afford it, they haven't got the IT experience to do that. Were there some controls that you saw that were very common along the smaller businesses?
Yeah. An example of that is business continuity. So some questions that were asked in relation to business continuity to some organizations, one of the things I found was that some small organizations said that because of the costs, they can't afford some settings. Example is to have hot. have hot sites and then have hot sites for their failover, that they could not afford that. So because of that, they had to start thinking of other alternatives. Some other ones outrightly said that they are looking into business continuity, but it's not priority for them because of different factors. So one key gap, again, from my research is that large organizations, again, because of structure, decision making, and all of those things, they're able to put some things in place. But when you look at the small organizations, they consider different limitations that would affect them to put those things in place, and then they just go for what is probably readily available for their business, or once their operations can go smoothly without some of them, they put them aside. But when the cyber attack happens...
Good. Can I ask a second question on that?
Yeah.
Is that all right? So when you then scale that to an enterprise, would you say that that's the first set of controls they do because they're quick wins for a business? So I'm just thinking of a recent case that I was involved with where the CISO needed to make, because it was a new CISO, they need to make some quick wins to look good in front of the business. So obviously the easy one to do is the free, quick, easy stuff off the gout, which is kind of what a small organisation would do. So just thinking about your mapping you've got, are they a set of controls that almost we need to automatically prioritise, even the scale of the business, large or small, because passwords, easy, quick, win, done. But as a large organisation, you could also do the same kind of thing. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I agree with that point. There are some controls that, whether large or small organizations, they come as quick wins. Just like you've said, if you look at the cost of some controls, they are low compared to others. As someone who has done risk management for about 10 years now, one of the things I found is that when we identify risk in organizations and you recommend controls, some organizations would say that because of the cost of the control, we would look for other ways to treat this risk. Example, they can tell you that we are going to take this to the management and a decision will be made on it to accept it as a high risk because they cannot afford to implement it. Why is that? Some controls may require the purchase of security solutions, for example, which can be very expensive, especially if it is a small organization. So organizations would rather either look for a compensating control or totally look for other ways to treat that risk in that instance. So yes, that is a factor. And organizations look for, even me as a practitioner, one of the things I do is that when I go to an organization, I try to look for controls that are easy, that they can, I know that this control, no matter what, they should be able to implement it. Example, access control. The ISO standard does not say that you must have biometric to access a place. But the ISO standard says that you should establish processes to manage your access. I've done an assessment in an organization whereby their server room is only managed with a key. But they did not fail the ISO certification because the standard does not say the server room should not be managed with a key. But that is what they can afford. And also because of their business, it's a small organization. They feel like this is not where the investment of our business should be in. And they did that for the organization. And it passed the ISO certification.
Cool.
Time for one final question?
Yeah, sorry, apologies, I'm not a technical expert, but I was just curious and kind of, I suppose, touching on what you said there as well. How has industry kind of responded to your research? I suppose with like your two hats on as both a researcher and then a practitioner who's kind of dealing in the, you know, the weeds of this stuff. How has industry responded to that kind of call to, you know, you need to prioritise all of these controls, not, you know, have them in a specific list? I'm just curious about that.
Okay, so in terms of how has the industry reacted, so this is, my research is still fairly new.
Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things I plan to do is application of this, because like I said when I started, what is the motivation for this research? The truth is that cybersecurity threats and attacks is not going anywhere. If it does, some of us will not be able to feed again, because that's where we feed from. So what I'm saying in essence is that this is a step to make industries aware that there is work to be done. You cannot say this is low priority. As someone who has worked in the industry, attackers look for low priority controls in quotes because that is what they will use as an entry point to the organization.
Yeah.
So industry will definitely react in terms of, if I take this to the industry, for example, it's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Even if you can't implement the ISO standard, you need to identify the controls that are key to your environment. When you identify them and you selected them, you assess the maturity of those controls. If there are any gaps from it, you implement it, and you ensure that you do a full integration of those controls.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. I mean, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? I mean, the beauty of this kind of work is its completeness, is its roundedness. I suppose this was a discovery I made when I did my PhD, which wasn't actually as long ago as all that. I was quite late to the route. So the difference between a lot of the consultancy that we see now is that people are going out making good recommendations, but there isn't that completeness of circle looking at the effectiveness and the prioritization, and then keeping that going. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this route map and the toolkit that is likely to come out of it will actually apply, because I mean it's an absolute perfect case study of a kind of industry and academia working together. So you actually get the rigor and both the relevance. And with some of my students in the room, I suppose I would do an advert for PhDs, but they're cool. So, right, thank you very, yeah, absolutely, yes.